A Palestinian organization, the DFLP, was said to have been responsible, but a senior official for that organization has denied responsibility. So at the present, we do not know who was responsible for these attacks in the United States, at the World Trade Center in New York and at the Pentagon in Washington. Washington has been evacuated. The heart of Washington, government offices are being evacuated. You can see at the moment pictures from around the Pentagon, rescue workers trying to put out the blaze. We saw an ambulance go by a few minutes ago. Stephen Speech is in Washington. Stephen, what's the latest information we have?
Well, the latest information is that government buildings around the city, around Washington, D.C., have been evacuated. There is a fire going on at or around the Pentagon. It appears that a third plane crashed into or very nearby the Pentagon, in addition to the two planes that crashed into the World Trade Center. No reports of casualties here in Washington, but I think many casualties, certainly perhaps 5 more dead in the World Trade Center and many, many injured.
Joining us now is Greg Barrow in New York. Greg, what's the latest information from the World Trade Center?
Well, the latest we have is that the whole area has been sealed off. The police and security personnel are down there trying to clear members of the public away. This was a very, very busy time of the morning in New York, just as everybody was going into their offices, so it couldn't really have come at a worse time. And I think that the search is already beginning for those who may be to blame for this incident that has really, truly shocked people, not just here in New York, but also around the country.
Any word on fatalities? It was a very, very busy time.
Well, it was a busy time. We won't know for some time yet just how many people were killed or injured. Now, if there were large numbers of people on the planes that crashed into the building, then clearly that is going to lead to a very, very high death toll. The offices, it was at a time when people would have just been going into work. It's unclear how full those offices would have been, but there could have been hundreds, maybe thousands of people in those offices at the time that the planes impacted into the building. So potentially there are huge numbers of casualties, but really too early to say precisely what's happening at this stage.
When we were talking to eyewitnesses earlier, they said that the situation seemed to be out of control, that the explosions were just running, and it looks as if the tower, one of the towers, has fallen down. Is that your understanding?
Well, this is just such an unexpected event. It's something that nobody could plan for. Obviously, in 1993, there was an explosion at the World Trade Center. A bomb was set off, but I think even in people's wildest imaginations, nobody could have foreseen 2 planes crashing into each tower of the Twin Trade Center. And the fact that this has happened, and such an unusual event, such a shocking event, perhaps has stunned not just the emergency services, but everyone around.
We're looking at the very disturbing pictures from New York of the World Trade Center. Only one tower is standing. The other has collapsed. You can see an extraordinary amount of smoke billowing out. It's the result of an attack by 2 planes which flew into each of the towers at around 9 o'clock this morning. It appears to have been a deliberate terrorist attack, a suicide mission. Only one of the World Trade Center towers is standing. In Washington, we've also seen an attack on the Pentagon, or close to the Pentagon, the U.S. Defense headquarters. The White House and the Capitol have been evacuated. These are apparent terrorist attacks. That's what the U.S. President George Bush said. And a U.S. official, citing a transmission from the plane, says one of the 2 planes that crashed into the World Trade Center was hijacked after takeoff from Boston. The Federal Aviation Authority has grounded all planes for the moment and closed all airports. All of the major road links into New York have also been closed, but we don't yet have any word on the extent of injuries or possible fatalities from the attacks. Stephen Speech is in Washington, and joins us now. Stephen, what news have you got?
Well, the latest I have for you is the Associated Press news agency is saying that the plane that crashed here in Washington crashed into a helicopter launch pad near the Pentagon. So it seems, if that report is correct, that the Pentagon itself has not been hit, but there is a fire in the vicinity. The White House and other government buildings and, of course, the Pentagon have been evacuated, but certainly no reports of casualties here in Washington.
We're looking at smoke billowing out of the World Trade Center. An hour ago, it was attacked by a plane, and then a second plane went into the other World Trade Center tower in New York. A short while ago, that tower collapsed onto the ground in huge puffs of smoke. There's been panic around at the World Trade Center. It was at a very busy time of day. These appear to have been terrorist attacks. A Palestinian organization, the DFLP, appeared to have said that it was responsible. That has now been denied. It's not known who is responsible for these attacks at the landmark World Trade Center in New York and against the US Defense Headquarters in the Pentagon. Another plane appears to have flown into that. At least one of the planes that attacked the World Trade Center, it's believed, was hijacked and had originally flown from Boston. The US President George Bush said he will hunt down those who are responsible for attacking the United States in this way. With us here in the studio is Jim Fish. Jim, what's the latest information we have?
Well, it's a scene of absolute and utter chaos and devastation that we're looking at. It has appeared in the last few minutes that the south tower of the World Trade Center collapsed after it was struck about an hour ago by that second aircraft. We can't, because of the extent of that devastation, the thick cloud of smoke that's now covering most of Manhattan, it's impossible to tell to what extent, what the extent of the damage is, and I think for that reason it'll take some time to find out how great the casualty toll is, but we can only speculate that if that second tower has collapsed or partially collapsed, then there will be sheer destruction and devastation on the ground, and because it was such a busy time of the day, early morning in Manhattan, we do know that the security services had sealed off the area around the trade towers, but I'm afraid to say that it does seem that the casualty toll will have climbed disastrously if the second tower has collapsed, because there will have been hundreds, possibly thousands of people within the vicinity of that tower.
And we're seeing layer upon layer of tragedy here. The original planes that went into the World Trade Centers were apparently themselves hijacked. At least one of them was. The latest news we've got is that it was an American Airlines plane, possibly with a number of passengers on it, which went straight into the top of the World Trade Center. Then we're seeing the World Trade Center on fire at a very busy time of the morning, full of office workers. One of the blocks collapsed. We don't know to what extent it was successfully evacuated before it happened. So scenes of extraordinary carnage and scenes of extraordinary destruction in New York at the World Trade Center, one of the landmarks of the Manhattan skyline. Over in Washington, another attack, this time against the US government itself. We've got pictures from the Pentagon. Close by to the Pentagon, another plane, possibly also hijacked, went into or near the Pentagon. Smoke billowing from there. The fires appear to be out of control. We don't yet know whether there have been any casualties. One can only imagine. The word from Washington is that the White House, the Pentagon, and all government offices have been evacuated. All planes in the United States have been grounded and airports have been shut down. The United States has really gone into emergency mode now, hasn't it, Jim?
Yes, and the extraordinary thing is that because of the extent of these attacks, these disasters, I think there's an overload of the emergency services, and of course the news, the information that is emerging from both New York and Washington has been restricted as a result. I think they are working flat out just to try and get to grips with the scale of these disasters. So we're unable to know, we can't tell you yet what the extent of the casualties is. This is the very first few minutes, the first hour of these events taking place. But it's impossible to say at the moment how the emergency services are dealing with these twin strikes. It seems that the New York World Trade Center attack has now been complicated by the collapse or partial collapse of one of those towers. You can see by the extent of the thick cloud of smoke that's enveloping the entire area that emergency work by the fire services, by the rescue services, must be difficult, if not impossible. Reaching up to the very top of those towers, it's difficult to say. There have been helicopters on the scene, but of course now their job has been further complicated by the sheer thick weight of that smoke enveloping the two towers, or what's left of them.
This is the second major attack against the World Trade Center. The first was in 1993, a bomb attack by Islamic militants. What we haven't ever seen before, though, is a major attack against the Pentagon in Washington, the heart of the US government. It will shake up Washington considerably, won't it, Jim?
You can't think of a more direct hit into striking at the very heart of US government, apart from, of course, the White House itself. And it's for that reason, I'm sure, that although President Bush is not in the White House, he's been in Florida this morning, that's for that very reason that the White House and all other government buildings in Washington have been evacuated. I think the US administration must now be thinking what other possible targets must be looming up if the heart of its defense establishment has now been hit, plus the two twin towers, the symbol of US financial business in the United States and around the world. I think they will be thinking now whether or not there are other targets that have been selected.
And there are concerns about the United Nations headquarters in New York as well. Joining us from New York is the BBC's Greg Barrow. Greg, what's the latest information you have?
Well, not much to add, only that we're witnessing the collapse of those two World Trade Center towers that were hit this morning, and huge amounts of smoke and debris billowing out from the bottom of those buildings, spreading down the streets 2 or 3 blocks around that area. So a whole area, several hundred meters in circumference, has now been affected by this explosion. And one can only imagine the scenes at the bottom there when this happened, as the emergency services were trying to evacuate those buildings.
A job made extremely difficult by the sheer amount of smoke.
Yes, and we should also mention the time that this attack took place. This was one of the busiest times of the morning, rush hour, as people were going to work in one of the most heavily populated areas, cities in America. So the problems that those emergency services are facing are just huge.
We're just looking at a lone helicopter battling against the clouds above the World Trade Center. The emergency services must be extremely stretched.
Yes, I think visibility down there is just one of the many problems. Also the concern that maybe the second tower could go tumbling down. These two of the tallest buildings in the world, when they fall, the amount of bricks and mortar and glass and debris cascading down in a very, very densely populated area is bound to cause yet more casualties. So I think the main aim of the emergency services at the moment is to get as many people as possible away from those buildings.
Any word from the local hospitals, Greg?
Not yet. I think that they will just be sort of completely overburdened with the immediate injuries. I think one of the greatest difficulties is getting people through the traffic and through the streets and to those emergency services as quickly as possible. I think you can probably see the huge crowds of people in that area, which will only impede efforts to get the injured to hospital.
The picture in New York there. There's also been an attack in Washington. We've got reports that there's been a second attack at the Pentagon earlier. These pictures are from New York, I believe. We saw earlier that one of the towers of the World Trade Center had collapsed. There are considerable fears about whether the second tower will be able to stand up for much longer, and that is, of course, hampering the efforts of the rescue services. About 9 o'clock this morning, we saw 2 planes going straight into the World Trade Center, and you can see the picture there, smoke still billowing, the fire's completely out of control. It's making the job of the rescue services extremely difficult. We've seen a few helicopters trying to get to the scene, but visibility must be extremely difficult for them. Jim Fish is with me here. Jim, we're not getting very much information at the moment as to injuries, as to the number of people that may have been caught up in this terrible, terrible accident, this terrible incident.
It's difficult enough for the emergency services to actually gain access to the sites of these terrible events. Particularly in New York, the pictures we're looking at, you can see now the thick pall of smoke that's enveloping the scene. One of the other problems there, of course, is that these fumes will be extremely toxic. That'll mean that only people with proper breathing apparatus will be able to get anywhere near the rescue work. I think that's probably going to be restricting work as well.
We've got an eyewitness here telling us about the scene there at the World Trade Center in New York.
Complete mayhem, but everybody, few people took charge and they kept calm and kept moving people down. So thank God. Halwani Tariq.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Good luck.
A warning to the US, that eyewitness said. You can see people looking up to the skies in disbelief in the United States, in New York. The World Trade Center there almost entirely obliterated by smoke. Only one tower is still standing. The other has been brought down by an astonishing suicide bomb attack, twin suicide missions by 2 planes, one of which at least appears to have been a hijacked United Airways 737. You can see the skyline over New York is just a mass of cloud, a lone helicopter trying to find its way in. It happened at one of the busiest times, the 9 o'clock morning rush hour, and it's still not apparent who attacked, who is responsible for this scene of carnage. Over in Washington, there were scenes at the Pentagon, similar scenes, smoke billowing out because the Pentagon, the US Defense Headquarters, was also under attack. 1, possibly 2 plane attacks. The BBC's Stephen Speech is there. Does it look as if there have been 2 attacks on the Pentagon, Stephen?
So far, I think we're talking about 1. Now, that may change, but at the moment, it seems to have been just the 1 aircraft. I mean, I'm saying just 1 aircraft. I mean, it is an extraordinary event for an aircraft to crash, it seems, next to the Pentagon. It appears the building itself was not hit. The reports we're getting is that there was a huge explosion which threw people off their feet inside the Pentagon. That's according to US officials and eyewitnesses. And they're talking about an airliner, so we're talking about a large vehicle, a large plane crashing near the Pentagon, it seems just by a helicopter launch pad. And one reporter who happened to be inside the building at the time, she's been quoted as saying that she was thrown to the ground by the force of the blast.
Just coming up now.
There are the press agents and everybody else that went the other way as everybody else went this way.
When you saw this collapse taking place, could you see if there were a lot of people on the ground near the building as it was happening?
No, I was further north than you were, but I was dead looking at 6th Avenue, the view you see of both towers as you come down 6th Avenue.
Right.
So, and most of this fallout stops about there.
An eyewitness to the World Trade Center attack, an extremely audacious terrorist attack against the World Trade Centers in New York. Jim Fish, the BBC's Jim Fish, has the latest information.
We are now getting more information about what may have happened, may have led up to these incidents, these attacks. General Richard Myers, who's the Vice Chairman of the US Joint Chiefs of Staff, has been reported by one of the news agencies, Associated Press, as saying that one hijacked plane was known about by officials heading from the New York area to Washington. Of course, they wouldn't have had time if that was the aircraft that hit close to the Pentagon. They obviously didn't have time to give out an alert. The other two aircraft, it's possible we have one unnamed US official saying that one was hijacked after takeoff from Boston, and a third was hijacked from Newark, New Jersey.
Let's just listen to what this eyewitness in New York is saying.
And we looked out at it, all of a sudden, boom, it seemed like it wasn't even real. And we came running over here closer to the place, and all of a sudden we saw the other explosion. I don't know. You know, that's all I saw. I saw a couple of people jumping out of the other building. I seen 2 or 3 people jump out of the building. The first one, I don't know if that's number 1 tower, number 2 tower. It's unreal.
Move back. Gotta move back.
Panic on the streets of New York there, people running away from the vicinity of the World Trade Center, where earlier 2 planes slammed into the sides of the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center. They're clearly being sent as far away as possible. Scenes of fear and pandemonium in New York. As you can see, the Twin Towers, one is already down, the other is billowing with smoke, the fire still out of control. That people should be as close as this is perhaps rather worrying. It happened in the middle of the 9 o'clock rush hour, and you can see that the police are trying to clear the streets and get people as far away from the building as possible. Perhaps they're worried that the second Twin Tower might collapse. We saw the first come down with a terrible bang. You can see the fire still raging. Let's just hear what this man has to say.
I was in B Tower. A Tower.
What floor were you on?
B1.
What floor?
First one.
What happened? Tell me.
When a big explosion happened, some guy came out, his skin was all off. I helped him out. This is him all over. There's people jumping out of windows. I've seen at least 14 people jumping out of windows. It's horrific. I can't believe this is happening.
Anything else that you saw? Were you there for the second hit by the plane?
About 10 minutes later, the second building went off.
Did you see it?
Yes, I saw it. It just blew up. A big explosion. People started running. It was just chaos everywhere. People jumping out. People just kept jumping and jumping and jumping. And you could still see they were alive because they were flailing around.
The FBI has already stepped in to investigate. It could be possibly a terrorist strike.
It could be. It could be because the first one went off and then 10 minutes later this just blew up out of nowhere.
Hard to think that that would just be accidental.
No, I don't think it would be accidental.
Back it up, folks. Back it up. Kenny?
Johanneman.
Spell your name.
Johannemann.
And you were working there?
Yes, I was right there.
Eyewitness telling what he saw, a huge fireball at the World Trade Center as 2 planes slammed into the side of these Twin Towers in the bottom of Manhattan. The security personnel were trying to move them along. The streets of New York are being cleared, possibly for fear that the second Twin Tower will come down. Earlier we saw one of the towers collapse in an enormous thud of debris and smoke. It's an extremely dangerous situation still in the scenes in the streets of New York. In Washington, meanwhile, there's been an attack just near the Pentagon. These are pictures of New York. You can see FBI personnel trying to clear the streets. The FBI are investigating these attacks. The US President has said that those responsible will be hunted down and brought to justice. But that's a long way off yet. At the moment, the most important thing is simply trying to stabilize the situation, putting out the fires, and helping the many hundreds of people who have been caught up in one of the most audacious attacks in the United States. You can see just how upset and shocked people are. It happened at one of the busiest times.
Bang! And then we saw smoke coming out, and everybody started running out, and we saw the plane on the other side of the building, and there was smoke everywhere, and people are jumping out the windows. Over there, they're jumping out the windows, I guess because they're trying to save themselves. I don't know. And I don't know, everybody just doesn't know where to go. They won't let, everything is blocked off. You can't even, they're telling us to get out, but there's nowhere to go. And then I heard that another plane hit, And if you go over by there, you can see the people jumping out the window. They're jumping out the window right now. Oh, my God.
All right, ma'am, thank you.
The panic of an eyewitness at the World Trade Center, talking about people jumping out of the windows of the World Trade Center to try and escape the collapsing World Trade Center as a result of 2 suicide plane attacks. Joining us from Washington is Stephen Speech. There's also been an attack near to the Pentagon, the U.S. Defense Headquarters. Stephen, what can you tell us?
It seems that a large aircraft, it's being described as an airliner, crashed into just near the Pentagon, near the west side of the Pentagon, near a helicopter launch pad, or on a helicopter launch pad. There was a big explosion. Eyewitnesses and officials say they were thrown to the ground by the force of the blast. It appears there have been some injuries. One news agency, AFP, is talking about 7 injuries. No reports of any fatalities from that incident here in Washington. But the Pentagon's been evacuated, the White House evacuated, and various other government buildings. So a sense of a great shock and great alertness here in Washington.
And presumably all the airports in the United States have been grounded as a result of this. 3 planes apparently hijacked.
Well, certainly, yes, at least one of them hijacked, we think. And yes, commercial flights have been completely suspended throughout the country. And we're also getting reports that Virgin Atlantic have cancelled their flights actually into the country. So it seems that international flights may also be affected. I mean, it's hard to overstate the magnitude of this, both in terms of the terrible tragedy in New York, and also just in terms of the symbolic power of these attacks on such prominent targets by some very, very determined people.
Stephen Speech in Washington. So at least one of the planes that went into the World Trade Center appears to have been hijacked. We don't really know much about the other 2. There's been an attack on the other World Trade Center and also the Pentagon, near to the Pentagon in Washington, the defense headquarters. Who is responsible? That is still unclear. The Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine have denied being behind the attack.
The DFLP has no relation to this accident or this incident. We have always been against terroristic actions, against civilian targets, and especially outside the occupied territories. But in spite of that, we deny our responsibility, but we call upon the American administration to review their attitude and their policy towards the Palestinian question, because this policy arouses the anger and the hatred of our people and of all Arab and Islamic peoples, and it's liable actually to harm the interests of the United States in our region, and therefore it has to be reviewed.
Denial from the Palestinian group, the DFLP, that it was responsible for attacking the World Trade Center. We've also got reports coming through that a car bomb has exploded outside the State Department in Washington. That's according to senior law enforcement officials. Let me just remind you, there have been several attacks on the nerve centers of the US administration. We're looking at pictures from New York, of the World Trade Center, which at 9 a.m. this morning came under attack by 2 planes. You can see the fire engines there trying to put out the fire. It's been raging for over an hour at the moment, and still no sign of it coming under control. The first plane went in at about 9 o'clock. A short while later, another aircraft appears to have crashed near the Pentagon in Washington. The White House and Capitol in Washington have been evacuated. These are apparently terrorist attacks. That's what the US President George Bush called them. A US official, citing a transmission from one of the planes, said that the first plane that crashed into the World Trade Center was hijacked after takeoff from Boston. The Federal Aviation Authority has grounded all planes for the moment and closed all airports. All the major road links into New York have also been closed. We have no word yet at the moment on the extent of injuries from the attacks. This report from Mike Wooldridge.
This was the second of the two explosions. A plane comes in from the right of the picture and appears to be about to pass behind the South Tower. Next comes a huge explosion with debris showering out from the tower and down towards the streets below. The upper floors of this tower then become immediately obscured by the billowing smoke. This was just a few minutes after there'd been another explosion near the top of the North Tower. Eyewitnesses said this tower appeared to be struck by a plane that came in low and then hit the building at a slight angle. Again, within seconds, the upper floors were consumed by flames and smoke. As panic erupted at ground level in New York's financial center at the start of the business day, the city and the country tried to make sense of it. Many of those who'd seen it happen said they were assuming these were planes that had flown deliberately into the two landmark buildings. It was simply hard to believe otherwise. The aircraft seemed to make no attempt to swerve away from the towers. As news of the casualties began to come in, the administration firmed up this growing belief that it seemed to be a terrorist attack. The FBI said it was investigating reports that two planes had been hijacked before the attack. And then, as New Yorkers were watching it all happen again, the towers were struck by bombers in 1993. Less than an hour later came unconfirmed reports that something similar may have happened at the Pentagon in Washington. There were reports of an explosion at the heart of the US defense establishment, and this was the scene afterwards. The White House was evacuated too. Mike Wooldridge, BBC News.
So these are the pictures now. It's Nick Gowing replacing Nisha Pillay, and you can see still the plumes of smoke. We do have news that a car bomb has exploded outside the State Department. Most offices of state in Washington have now been evacuated. The Pentagon is now very much subject to a major fire and emergency alert. There you have pictures in downtown New York. In the area, I think, from what I can see, near the World Trade Center, one of the towers has collapsed. Both towers have now collapsed. We gather this is within about an hour and a half of the towers being hit by a hijacked plane, which has been confirmed as an American Airlines plane, which had set off from Boston bound for Los Angeles. American Airlines 11, according to authorities in Boston. The Federal Aviation Administration has now grounded all planes right across the United States, fearful of what might happen next and what other intentions those who've coordinated this attack might have. President Bush, who was speaking down in Sarasota in Florida, called this an apparent terrorist attack. That's literally as the news was coming through. This is the scene now from downtown New York. One can imagine the chaos there, but also this is going to have a massive effect on the infrastructure of the United States on the eastern seaboard. There, the Pentagon, you can still see the smoke rising from one part. Apparently the airliner hit the helicopter pad, which is just across the main freeway from the Potomac River. That's eyewitnesses saw the tail of the plane go into that helicopter pad, which is just outside one of many doors in the Pentagon, which of course is the Defense Department. That is only one small part of the Pentagon, because below ground, if my memory serves me correct, there are at least 7 floors. This was built expecting some kind of nuclear attack one day, and that's where the most heavily defended and protected parts of the Pentagon are, well down deep into the bowels of Virginia there, across the river. Here we have the center of New York. Not only the World Trade Center, but reports saying the UN headquarters has been evacuated, with people being ushered down into the basement of the UN headquarters, which is a little bit uptown from the World Trade Center, which is right down on the southern tip of Manhattan. Well, let's go to another witness of the World Trade Center attack, and he said he saw people jumping from the building.
And we looked out at it, and all of a sudden, boom, it seemed like it wasn't even real. And we came running over here closer to the place, and all of a sudden we saw the other explosion. I don't know. You know, that's all I saw. I saw a couple of people jumping out of the other building. I've seen 2 or 3 people jump out of the building. The first one, I don't know if that's number 1 tower or number 2 tower. It's unreal.
downtown New York there, and there the scene across Manhattan. A scene where, in normal times, you'd expect to see at least 2 towers of the World Trade Center. They have now both collapsed following the hijack of at least one aircraft which was flown directly into one of the towers. That collapsed about 40 minutes ago. The second one collapsed a few minutes ago. There's the shot of the southern tip of Manhattan. Over to Washington to Stephen Sweet. Stephen, what do you have?
Well, the latest is that in addition to the attack on the Pentagon, the fire there, the airliner crashing into the helicopter launch pad, there has been a car bomb outside the State Department, the headquarters of US foreign policy. The building's been evacuated. We don't have reports of any casualties. President Bush, who has been in Florida this week, is heading back to Washington. And we also have, this is quoting the CBS television network, this is to give some idea of potentially the scale of the tragedy in New York. CBS are saying that of the 2 planes that crashed into the World Trade Center, one was from Boston, the other was from Dallas, and it's possible that on board there may have been 150 people.
Now, what is the scene in Washington at the moment? Can you see out across to the smoke across the Potomac and the level of smoke which is coming from there?
It's difficult for me here in the studio to see that. But I think a sense of great shock here in Washington. So far it seems that in terms of casualties, we don't have anything like the sort of tragedy that's unfolding in New York. But in terms of the explosion that went off at the Pentagon, knocked people to the ground, car bomb at the State Department, I think a lot of government buildings, if not all of them, have been evacuated. Certainly the Capitol, the Congress building up on the Hill, the State Department, the White House, the Pentagon, the Treasury, all those seem to have been evacuated, and I wouldn't be surprised if all the other government buildings have been evacuated too.
Now, Stephen, in recent years, certainly the Security Secret Service, the FBI, and all the intelligence agencies have insisted that there be much better protection from ground attacks, certainly, against those who might wish to drive or try to drive up to the White House, Congress, or whatever. But clearly this is not enough in this kind of situation.
Well, we know that the United States, some people would say that they're obsessed with security here, but clearly however far you take security precautions, one has to ask the question, is it ever going to be enough? We know that President Bush wants to defend the United States from attack by missiles with his missile defense program. Some people think that's possible, others think it isn't. But when you have people who are absolutely determined to carry out these attacks, determined, it seems, to lose their own lives in the process, it really does make us ask the question, how far is it possible to avoid incidents like this? Planes can fly at low altitudes, they can avoid detection by radar. We had the incident 20 years ago, this is going back some way in time, where a young German pilot flew into Moscow, into Red Square, after flying right through Soviet air defenses. And it seems that even today it's still quite possible for that sort of thing to happen. So of course we're going to have people raising the issue of greater security here. But as I said, we have to ask the question, is that possible to really totally protect these buildings?
Now, for those of you who are just joining BBC World at this point and wondering if you're watching an unreal scene, this is real scene from downtown New York, shortly after this plane crashed into the World Trade Center. It had been hijacked a short time earlier on a trip, we believe, from Boston. We understand it was an American Airlines plane en route from Boston to Los Angeles, flight American Airlines 11, and that was what began what has been a cataclysmic 2 hours in the United States, because a second plane was hijacked, a third plane was hijacked close to Washington and has been flown into an area which is just to the side of the Pentagon, across the river from the White House, Congress, the executive buildings, the Treasury buildings, the World Bank, and all the main offices of state. That a reminder of the terrible incident which began this trigger, this timetable of dreadful events across the east coast of America. There is the Pentagon, the southern part of the defense headquarters, the brain of the American political, at least, defense system. Of course, they have a large number of bunkers and other secure areas scattered right across the United States, down in Florida, Cheyenne Mountain, across in Colorado, many other secure areas, and indeed there are provisions within the American procedures for the President, Secretary of State and others to take shelter along with those who have to make the critical decisions. Here the scene on the ground in New York, and not that I'm there, but it does look as if you can see, you can get a sense of the enormous amounts of dust and debris and everything else which have been blown and literally across in a typhoon from the bottom of the World Trade Center after first the first tower, then the second tower collapsed at the bottom of Manhattan. That distinct landmark at the bottom of Manhattan. And that's the scene in what is left in that area alongside the World Trade Center. Ola Gerin, our correspondent, is joining me from Jerusalem. Ola, how is this being viewed from the Middle East?
Well, there's an enormous sense of shock here. People have been glued to their television screens with mounting horror, watching the events unfold. I should say that it's still in no way clear that the events taking place in the United States are at all connected to this region, although obviously that must be the fear, and there's a great deal of speculation of that kind. We did earlier on have one anonymous claim of responsibility that was made to a television station in Abu Dhabi, and a caller claiming to represent a radical Palestinian faction, the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine, claimed that they had carried out the hijackings and they had attacked the World Trade Center. Now, I should stress that since then, official spokesmen for that organization have been at pains to say that they were not involved. They issued